I've always loved good storytelling, especially in the form of literature and fiction. It's something I've always found joy in pursuing. When I was a little kid, when my grandpa read me The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings series, till just now finishing Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. Good literature and storytelling is something I've always really enjoyed. And the aim of my speech is to share the value I see in it and the utility I see in a good story for humanity as a whole. The value of story to humanity as a whole is not something too terribly difficult to argue for. It's, after all, something how, for our entire history, has been intrinsic to the way we see reality and how we build our perception of reality. From oral tradition, thousands and thousands of years ago, to the first written story we have, the Epic of Gilgamesh from 2000 BC. Story is something that is clearly important to us. I use the example of the Epic of Gilgamesh because I think it's a fantastic example, firstly, of storytelling's importance to humanity and what a good story has at its core. And it's almost really absurd that we have a story from this time because of the context of the author. The author sitting down to write this was from Mesopotamia, 2000 BC. Their life would be ruled by chaos, starvation, and death. When they sat down to write it, their life expectancy would be about 18. So that shows you that they sat down for a reason. It wasn't just, when you have time like that, you don't sit down to do something useless. The story revolves around two friends, Gilgamesh and Enkidu, who go on a quest for immortality. At first, they seek this through fame, through a great deed to have their names descended through history, through killing a giant. This doesn't work out so well for them, and Enkidu's killed by the giant. Gilgamesh is destroyed by the loss of his friend and goes on his own personal quest for immortality. He actually achieves this. He swims to the bottom of this ocean in this great journey and finds this plant that he can eat and be granted eternal life. But he foolishly celebrates instead of eating the plant, and a snake eats it in his sleep. And the author has Gilgamesh being tortured by this, but then eventually receiving redemption through realizing that his life is not meant for preserving or extending that life, but rather living in the present and doing good with the time he has. And the author of this epic sat down to do something. He intended to ask a question that I think all good stories have at their core, the asking of some basic question or claim. His question could have been, what makes life worth living when it's surrounded by death and chaos? It doesn't really matter the question, but good stories always have this at its core. Some question or claim that is presented to the reader, along with the characters and the narrative to struggle with. And to ultimately sit at the story's feet and wrestle with this question, and ultimately find some truth along the way. In my interview with Mr. Spector, we talked about how storytelling communicates truth and message in ways that normal things don't. He brought up the point that Jesus in the Bible doesn't necessarily gather his disciples and say, this is what you believe. He rather constructs a parable. He tells a story. He uses it as a vehicle for his truth rather than just saying it. And a good example of what this does, I think, is the author Ayn Rand. She is a very controversial figure, or was. Her philosophy, objectivism, I think, is a good example of what story can do for a message. Outside of her fiction and her magnum opus, Atlas Shrugged, her philosophy is, I think, very poorly communicated. It comes off as incredibly unempathetic and even unreasonable. But there's a reason she's famous, not as just a philosopher, but as for a writer. It's because when her philosophy finds a story, it becomes more human. When you take a message and give it the vehicle of story, it finds human characters. In her story, you can see objectivism lived out through her heroes. So when a message gets a human vehicle, it in turn becomes more human. and more relatable to the audience. And a good question to have with this sort of thing, or you could consider it almost paradoxical to look for truth in fiction. Like, why look into The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings or Atlas Shrugged? Why look to fiction for truth? If you want something real, why are you looking in something unreal? C.S. Lewis was asked a question along the same lines in a literary conference, and I really like his answer. He was asked, "Why, if you have some serious comment to make on the real life of men, must you do it by talking about some never land of your own?" C.S. Lewis responds, "Because, I take it, one of the main things the author wants to say is that the real life of men is of that mythical and heroic quality. The value of the myth is that it takes all of the things we know and restores them to the rich significance which has been hidden by the familiar." And I think that's just a really great answer. And he paints this picture of storytelling and fiction or fantasy as something that takes value that we no longer see because it's mundane, things that we see in our everyday lives or don't necessarily think about. And it takes that and puts it in an alien or fantastical setting. And that sort of contrasts that and makes it easier to realize the truth and value of whatever that is. Also in my interview with Mr. Spector, he set me onto the book Bandersnatch by Diana Glyer. It is her graduate thesis that details her research of the writing group, the Inklings. The two chief writers in it were C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, but there are many others. She talks about the processes they used to communicate their work and build their work. They would meet, and then they would share their work, and then the group would compliment or critique it, and then they would revise it, and then do it all over again. They did this with reading, too, not just the work of the author, or the authors in the group. And I think her thesis is essentially that writing and reading in a small community context of interested people really makes that thrive. I explored sort of a microcosm of this in my capstone with my own writing and sharing it with some peers. I think that was a good experience, but what I enjoy most and what I took the most value out of her book is her explaining what reading could do with other people and concerned friends. I very much experienced this last year with the book Infinite Jest. It started in my D group when Mr. Static brought up the question about goals. What is it to have goals and what is it to want things? In his talk about this, he mentioned Infinite Jest and David Foster Wallace's work. And that really gave me an interest in it. And so I went and got that book and started reading it. My friend Ian, too, also began reading that. And over the next few months, we read that book. And we would talk about it. And even over the summer, we met with Mr. Static and talked about it. And that was a really good experience for me. And I also bring up Infinite Jest because I think it serves really as a superlative example of the means of storytelling and how good storytelling should be executed. Infinite Jest is a hard book to sum up. It's classified as an encyclopedic novel, which its definition is an attempt to render the full range of knowledge and beliefs of a national culture while identifying the ideological perspectives from which that culture shapes and interprets its knowledge. And that's obviously a very ambitious and broad goal, but it's as close as anything I think could get to that. He says a lot about Western culture. It's a story that's very humbling. Through his fiction, he exposes not like just what we think, but why we think it, and it's largely a critique of Western thought. And he writes the story in a really valuable way, and the writing of the story serves its own claim. His book is evidence for his own theses. And I'll explain that. But for example, one of his main claims is that our culture has in some ways banished meaning from a lot of our entertainment and our art and what we consume, because meaning and ease are in many ways contradictory. That we've learned to equate satisfaction with ease, essentially, ease of access, surface level excitement. We want things that we don't have to immerse ourselves in, because immersion is hard and immersion requires essentially sacrifice. And he wrote the book in a way that requires you follow this. The book Infinite Jest is 1,079 pages. It's a ridiculous amount. And in the first 16 pages, he gives its conclusion. So he requires you, even at the very beginning, to be there not for the entertainment, not for the ease of access. He wants you to be there for something else. He wants you to be there for the questions the book poses, like what I said about this core of storytelling. He wants you to be there for the claims. He wants you to be there for the questions. He wants you to be there to struggle with it, and not for just the ease of having it. And this ultimately serves, I think, one of his main ideas, that what you consume consumes you back. It's a double-edged sword. He pictures it in his book Infinite Jest that so many people are conditioned to just seek out the easy, the simple, because there's no struggle in it. I use social media as an example. It's basically the epitome of that idea. It's barely anything of substance. It's focused on minimal absorption. It's just to glide right over you, sort of. And so if you consume things that are only surface level, only for the easiness of it, essentially, then you too will become surface level, and you too will become just an image. But the sword has another edge, and that's if you can find something good and something worth struggling with and consume it, it will consume you too. If you sit at the feet of a question that a good story poses, if you sit and struggle with a claim, that can really bring you something special. And to be consumed by a good question, to be consumed by a powerful claim, can mean your life has changed. It can mean many things. And it's just a fantastic thing that storytelling can do. And I think it's a great example of how storytelling acts as a tool. It can modify how you perceive reality, even though in our modern setting we have many poor tools for this. One idea that I think is detrimental to the idea of worth in story and literature and writing and even entertainment or art broadly is the idea of relatability. It's something very modern and something that is powerful in the culture that surrounds what we consume, is that for something to be good, it has to be incredibly and at its base relatable and representative of what the reader or the consumer thinks. It has to be chiefly relatable. There should be no one who picks up a book or a story and does not see themselves represented in some way. And I think this idea is in some ways destroying the greatest treasure writing and storytelling gives to us, and that is the ability to see the world through people's eyes who are radically different than us. It seeks out a mirror versus something of worth, and something of worth we can really take from storytelling. That's my speech.